Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I woke up to the unmistakable feeling that I wasn't alone. My body was rigid, the kind of stiffness that comes when you're jolted from sleep by something wrong. My mouth was dry, my heartbeat thudded against my ribs. And though the room was thick with darkness, I just knew, there was someone standing at the foot of my bed. I didn't want to look. My eyes were squeezed shut, as if the thin veil of my eyelids could protect me from whatever was lurking in the shadows. But the air felt wrong. The room was too cold, too still. My ears strained for a sound, breathing, shifting, but there was nothing. Silence pressed against my skull, growing heavier with each second that passed. Was it a dream? I had no reason to believe it wasn't at first, but the longer I lay there, the more my mind rebelled against that comfort. I wasn't a kid anymore. Not prone to nightmares that made me sit up screaming in the middle of the night. I was 32 years old, living alone in a quiet house outside of town. Nightmares didn't happen anymore. This felt real. I was fully awake now, heart slamming harder with each beat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. Slowly, fighting the sickening dread pooling in my gut, I cracked my eyes open. And there it was. A dark figure stood at the foot of my bed, tall and looming. Its outline was blurry, shifting slightly, like a shadow in the corner of your eye that disappears when you focus on it. But this wasn't going anywhere. It was solid, present, watching me. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It was like the air itself was pressing down on me, trapping me in place. My legs felt like lead, my arms pinned at my sides as if held by an invisible force. Sleep paralysis? That had to be it, right? A logical explanation, something my brain could cling to. I'd heard of it, read stories online about people waking up to strange figures in their rooms, unable to move or speak. But none of those stories mentioned the cold. None of them mentioned the sound of distant breathing that I was beginning to hear, deep, slow, deliberate. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up. I couldn't move, couldn't call for help. All I could do was watch, wide-eyed, as the figure stood there, its head cocked slightly to one side, as if curious. Then it moved. Slowly, its head turned to face me. The motion was unnaturally smooth, like something out of a glitchy video. There were no features, no eyes, but I could feel it staring at me. My skin crawled and an overwhelming sense of wrongness washed over me, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the inevitable fall. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Seconds, minutes, hours. Time didn't seem to matter. All that mattered was the thing standing at the foot of my bed, watching me, waiting for something I couldn't begin to comprehend. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, it began to fade. The shadowy outline blurred and dissolved, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. I gasped, my lungs filling with air as if I had been holding my breath for hours. My limbs were my own again. I sat up in bed, trembling, my eyes darting around the room for any sign of the figure. But it was gone. The house was deathly quiet. No sounds of creaking floorboards, no distant footsteps. Just silence. I sat there for a long time, staring at the foot of my bed, expecting it to return. But it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. I flicked on the bedside lamp, bathing the room in a soft yellow light. It didn't help. The room still felt off. The air still cold. I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, Stress from work, too much caffeine, or maybe I'd watched one too many horror movies. But the image of that figure standing at the foot of my bed haunted me. I could still feel its presence, its invisible eyes boring into me. Every time I glanced at the foot of my bed, I half expected it to be there, waiting. Days passed, and though I tried to forget, the feeling of being watched never left. My house didn't feel like my own anymore. Shadows seemed to linger too long, and at night, the air grew cold again. I found myself waking up at 3 a.m. every night, staring at the end of my bed, heart racing, waiting for the figure to return. And then, it did. It was a week after the first time. I woke up again to that same crushing feeling, that same unnatural cold. This time I didn't hesitate. My eyes flew open, and there it was, standing at the foot of my bed, exactly where it had been before. But something was different. It wasn't just standing there this time. It was closer. Panic gripped me. The figure had moved from the foot of the bed to the side, barely 2 feet from where I lay. I could almost feel the icy chill radiating from it. My breath caught in my throat, and once again, I couldn't move. It leaned down slowly until it was inches from my face, its head tilted, and though it had no eyes, no face, I knew it was staring right into me, through me. The breathing was louder now, rasping and unnatural, like air being sucked through broken glass. I was frozen, terrified, and then for the first time, it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice in my head, low and guttural, like the growl of something ancient and hungry. "You let me in." I didn't understand. My mind raced, trying to piece together the meaning behind those words. I hadn't let anything in. I didn't want this. I hadn't asked for this. But the figure didn't care. It straightened up, standing over me like a shadow that had grown too large to ignore. And then, without another sound, it faded again, leaving the room colder and emptier than before. I lay there for the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep, too terrified to move. The words echoed in my mind. "You let me in." It's been 3 weeks now since that night. 3 weeks of waking up at 3 a.m., waiting for the figure to return. 3 weeks of feeling like my house isn't mine anymore, like something else has taken over. It doesn't show itself every night, but I know it's there, watching, waiting. And last night, for the first time, I realized what it meant. I did let it in. When I first woke up that night and saw it, I should have closed my eyes. I should have fought the fear, pretended it wasn't real. But I didn't. I looked. I acknowledged it. And now, it's a part of me. I don't know what it wants, but I'm scared I'll find out soon, because tonight it wasn't just standing at the foot of my bed. Tonight it was sitting on the edge. I moved into the house last summer, a modest 2-story tucked away in the kind of sleepy suburban neighborhood where people kept to themselves. It was the perfect place for someone like me, a quiet house for a quiet life. After the chaos of city living, I wanted solitude, the kind that only came with silence and a front yard I didn't have to share with thousands of other strangers. The house had character. That's what the realtor kept saying as she led me from room to room. It wasn't old enough to be considered historical, but it had been built in the 1950s, so there were quirks, slightly uneven floors, wooden walls that creaked with the changing seasons. The quirks didn't bother me. In fact, I liked them. The place felt lived in, as if it held stories in its bones. I didn't care much for stories, though, at least not the kind houses like this tend to accumulate. I just wanted peace, and that's what I told myself I'd find. But the footsteps started on my second night there. It was late. I had just climbed into bed, my eyes heavy from unpacking boxes all day. The house was pitch black, the only light filtering through the blinds from the street lamp outside. My body was sore, and sleep came quickly, until it didn't. A soft creaking sound woke me, a familiar groan from the old wooden floors. I rolled over in bed, blinking away the fog of sleep, telling myself that houses make noises. Old floors creak, pipes shift, and the wind can make it sound like the walls are whispering. I ignored it and tried to drift off again. But then, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps walking down the hallway. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. The hallway outside my bedroom was narrow, a short passage between my room and the staircase that led down to the living room. The house was still new to me, and the thought of someone else being inside filled me with a sudden, sharp fear. The footsteps continued. They weren't quick, like someone running or rushing to get away. They were measured, purposeful, the sound of shoes tapping against the hardwood floors. I strained my ears, listening, holding my breath. The footsteps were getting closer. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and dialed 911, my thumb hovering over the call button. But then, they stopped. Complete silence. I sat in the dark, waiting, but no one came into the room. The hallway outside was empty, as far as I could tell. The house was silent again, as if nothing had happened. My heart was still racing, but after a few minutes I convinced myself that I had imagined it. I was overtired, in a new place, and every small sound seemed amplified. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I waited another hour before I finally allowed myself to fall back asleep, though it was fitful at best. The next morning, I checked the house from top to bottom. Every door was locked, every window shut. There was no sign of a break-in, nothing out of place, no footprints, no scuff marks on the floor. Just silence. The silence that I had craved so much when I left the city. But that silence soon became something I dreaded. The footsteps returned the following night, and the night after that. Each time the same slow, rhythmic pace down the hallway, stopping just before reaching my door. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the sound was coming from outside, or maybe it was the pipes after all. Maybe the old house was just settling, and I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. These footsteps were real, and they were inside my house. By the end of the first week, I was exhausted. I hadn't had a proper night's sleep since moving in. Every time I closed my eyes, I braced myself for the sound. I even tried sleeping with the door open, just to prove to myself that nothing would come into the room. But the footsteps never crossed the threshold. They stopped right at the doorway, waiting, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there knew I was listening. I started telling my friends about the noises, though I didn't go into too much detail. Most of them laughed it off, telling me it was just a new house thing, that I'd get used to it eventually. But one friend, Natalie, didn't laugh. "You sure it's just the house?" she asked, her voice low over the phone. "What else would it be?" I responded, trying to keep my tone light, but deep down I already knew what she was getting at. "Houses that old. Sometimes they've got history, you know. Maybe it's haunted." I scoffed, but I couldn't shake the idea once she'd planted it. I'd never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I was the kind of person who needed solid evidence before buying into that kind of thing. But as the nights dragged on, and the footsteps kept coming, I started to doubt myself. The worst part was that I never saw anything. No flickering lights, no moving objects, nothing you'd expect from a haunted house. Just the footsteps, always at the same time. Always the same slow, measured pace. After 2 weeks, I was at my breaking point. I was losing sleep, snapping at people for no reason, and every time night fell, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. That's when I started noticing other things. It was small at first. Shadows that didn't belong. A cold draft in the middle of summer. The feeling that I was being watched when I walked through the house. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, like someone passing by a doorway. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. I tried ignoring it, brushing it off as paranoia or exhaustion. But the more I ignored it, the more insistent it became. One night, after yet another sleepless evening of listening to those phantom footsteps, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let it drive me crazy. I grabbed a flashlight, swung my legs over the side of the bed, and stood up. If something was walking around my house at night, I was going to find it. The house was still, the kind of oppressive quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes every small sound seem deafening. I stepped into the hallway, the floor creaking under my feet. The flashlight beam swept across the narrow passage, illuminating nothing but blank walls and bare floors. My heart pounded in my chest, but I pressed forward. Down the stairs, past the living room, into the kitchen. I searched every inch of the house, even the basement, which was damp and smelled like old concrete. But there was nothing. No sign of an intruder. No explanation for the footsteps. Defeated, I went back to bed. But as soon as I pulled the covers over me, I heard it again. The footsteps, right outside my door. I froze. My heart leaped into my throat. I had just checked the entire house. There was no one here. No one except me. The footsteps stopped, and for the first time, I felt a presence. It was subtle, like a weight in the air pressing down on me. My skin crawled, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was in the hallway. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the dark outline of my bedroom door, waiting. And then, the door handle turned. The creak of the metal echoed in the silence, and the door slowly, agonizingly, began to open. I sat bolt upright, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand and shining it at the door. But there was nothing there. The door swung open fully, revealing an empty hallway. I was shaking now, cold sweat running down my back. My hand trembled as I clutched the flashlight, waiting for something, anything to appear. But there was nothing. Nothing except the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning I called a paranormal investigator. I hadn't wanted to. It felt ridiculous. I was a grown adult, and here I was, about to tell some stranger that I thought my house was haunted. But I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't keep living like this, sleep-deprived, paranoid, constantly on edge. I needed answers. The investigator, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude, arrived the following evening. His name was Greg, and he had been doing this sort of thing for years. He didn't promise results, but he said he'd seen his fair share of strange things. Greg walked through the house, waving some kind of device around and muttering to himself. I didn't understand half of what he was saying, but I followed him, hoping he would find something that would explain the footsteps. After about an hour, he stopped in the hallway outside my bedroom. "This is where you hear them, right?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the floor. "Every night," I replied. Greg nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There's a lot of energy here, not harmful necessarily, but strong." I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't care. I just wanted to know why it was happening. He knelt down and placed his hand on the floor as if feeling for something. After a long moment, he stood up and looked at me. "This house," he said, "there's something here. Something that's been here for a long time. It's not a person, not in the way you'd think, but it's attached." "Attached to what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "To the house, to this hallway." That night, I waited for the footsteps again. I knew they were coming, and they did. But this time, I didn't feel fear. I felt something else. Acceptance, maybe. Resignation. Whatever was walking in my hallway every night wasn't going anywhere. And neither was I. The footsteps stopped outside my door, as they always did. I didn't bother looking. I didn't need to. I just lay there in the darkness, listening and waiting. I never believed in ghosts. Not until I started working as a janitor at Ridgewood Middle School. It's not the kind of job people dream about. But I needed the extra cash to pay for college, so I took it. The school was old, nearly 100 years old actually. It had creaky wooden floors, outdated chalkboards, and long hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly, especially at night. That's when I started to notice things. At first, it was small, subtle, barely noticeable. But by the end of my first week, I had begun to feel like someone, or something, was always watching me. My shift was from 6 p.m. to midnight. By 8 p.m., the school was always empty, just me and my mop bucket, trudging through the halls. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional flickering of the fluorescent lights, or the distant echo of a door slamming shut. I tried to tell myself it was the building settling, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The air always felt thick, like something was lurking just beyond the shadows. There was one particular hallway, 3rd floor, east wing, that I always dreaded cleaning. It was older than the rest of the building, built in the early 1900s when the school was first established. Nobody ever went down there anymore. The classrooms had long been abandoned, their doors permanently locked. The windows were dusty, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. But I had to clean it. That was part of my job. And every time I pushed my mop down that hallway, I felt it. An overwhelming sense of dread, like I wasn't alone. One night it was worse than usual. I was halfway down the hallway when I heard it. A soft whisper just behind me. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself I was hearing things, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help me." The voice was faint, but it was real. It sounded like a child, and it was coming from one of the locked classrooms. I stood there, gripping my mop like it could protect me from whatever was on the other side of that door. My mind raced. It had to be a prank, right? Some kid who snuck back into the school after hours, trying to mess with me. But deep down, I knew better. I had checked all the doors. They were locked. Against my better judgment, I approached the door where the voice had come from. Room 312. The door was cracked open, just enough for me to peek inside. I hesitated for a moment before slowly pushing it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. The desks were covered in dust, the chalkboard untouched for decades. But there was something off, something that didn't belong. In the center of the room, sitting in one of the old wooden desks, was a little girl. She was pale, her hair tangled, and her clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a black-and-white photo. She looked up at me with wide, hollow eyes, her lips trembling. "Please help me," she whispered again. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot. My legs felt like lead, and my throat was dry. I managed to choke out, "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the far corner of the room, where a large wooden cabinet stood. My eyes followed her hand, and that's when I saw it. Carved into the wood of the cabinet were deep scratches, like something had been trying to claw its way out. The room suddenly felt ice cold, and a shiver ran down my spine. I stepped back, shaking my head. "I can't help you. I'm sorry." The little girl's expression changed. Her eyes darkened, and her lips twisted into a sinister smile. "You can't leave," she said, her voice no longer soft, but sharp and commanding. I bolted. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls, my heart racing faster than ever before. I didn't stop until I reached the janitor's closet. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, breathing heavily. My hands were shaking, and sweat dripped down my forehead. I leaned against the door, trying to calm myself down, but the pounding in my chest wouldn't stop. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. A soft, rhythmic tapping. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew I should stay inside, but curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to see. No one was there. I closed the door again, feeling a little foolish. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of the job and the creepy atmosphere were just getting to me. But then the knocking started again, this time louder, more urgent. I flung the door open and my blood ran cold. The little girl was standing there, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were black now and her skin was deathly pale. She smiled at me, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You shouldn't have left," she hissed. I stumbled back, falling onto the floor as she stepped into the room. I crawled backward, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But she kept coming closer, her eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the coldness radiating from her, suffocating me, filling the room with a suffocating chill. "I didn't mean to," I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. "I don't know what you want." She tilted her head, her smile widening. "You let me out." I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. I had to get out of there, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could feel her presence behind me, cold and unrelenting. I spun around, but she was gone. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, I heard it. The scratching sound, faint but persistent, coming from the corner. My gaze slowly drifted to the wooden cabinet, and the door was creaking open on its own. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. Out of the darkness of the cabinet, a figure emerged, tall, skeletal, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. It was worse than the little girl. This was something ancient, something evil. It moved toward me slowly, deliberately, like it knew I had no escape. My back hit the wall, and I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable. But then, nothing. When I opened my eyes again, the room was empty. The figure, the girl, they were gone. I was alone. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't. None of it made any sense. I stumbled out of the room, my legs weak and trembling. I didn't go back to Ridgewood after that night. I quit the next morning, packed up my things, and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I can still hear the whisper, "Help me." And I know that somewhere deep in the shadows of Ridgewood Middle School, that little girl is still waiting, still watching, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake I did. People don't usually talk about it, but I've always been drawn to places that shouldn't exist anymore. Abandoned buildings, decrepit houses, ghost towns where time has long since stopped. There's something unsettling about seeing what's left behind when life vanishes, and nothing captures that more than an abandoned hospital. It wasn't something I set out to do as a hobby, but after a few late-night urban exploration trips, it turned into an obsession. The thrill of sneaking into old buildings, exploring places no one had stepped into for years, made my heart race in a way nothing else could. I'd always heard rumors about St. Mercy's Hospital, an old psychiatric facility located a few towns over. It had been shut down in the late 1980s after a string of patient deaths and malpractice accusations. The place had a dark reputation, the kind of stories that floated around for decades. Ghost sightings, weird noises, even the occasional "don't go there" warning from the locals. Naturally, I wanted to see it for myself. I convinced my friend Dave to come with me, though he was more hesitant. He wasn't into this sort of thing, but he didn't want me to go alone. We set out on a rainy Saturday night, the kind where the wind howls through the trees, and the world feels like it's on the edge of something. St. Mercy's sat on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, hidden behind a thick forest of towering oaks. The drive there felt like a descent into another world, the kind of place you wouldn't expect to find in the middle of modern civilization. The building itself was a hulking mass of concrete and brick, its windows shattered and vines creeping up the walls like fingers reclaiming what humans had abandoned. The front doors had long been boarded up, but we found a broken window on the first floor, easy enough to climb through. As soon as we stepped inside, the air changed. It was heavy, stale, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. The only light came from our flashlights, which barely cut through the thick darkness that seemed to swallow the hallways. "Man, I don't like this," Dave muttered, his voice bouncing off the walls. "This place gives me the creeps." I wasn't about to admit it, but I felt it too. There was something wrong with St. Mercy's, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But I wasn't about to back down. We'd come this far. There was no turning around now. The main hallway stretched out before us, lined with doorways that led to patient rooms. The tiles beneath our feet were cracked, and the walls were covered in peeling paint and old graffiti. As we moved deeper into the hospital, I started to feel it. That sense that we weren't alone. It wasn't just paranoia, it was as if the shadows were watching us, creeping along the edges of our flashlight beams, waiting for us to let our guard down. I stopped in front of one of the patient rooms, the door hanging off its hinges. A thick layer of dust covered everything inside, but there were clear footprints leading toward the back wall. Fresh footprints. "Dave, check this out," I whispered, shining my light on the floor. He leaned in close, squinting at the tracks. "Maybe someone's been here recently." "Maybe," I replied, though I didn't believe it. The footprints didn't look like they were made by shoes. They were barefoot and too small for an adult, like a child's. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. We continued moving through the hospital, following the footprints as they twisted and turned through the winding hallways. The deeper we went, the more twisted and decayed the building became. Some of the walls were caved in, exposing metal piping and old rusted machinery. It was as if the place was rotting from the inside out. As we reached the end of one particularly long hallway, we came to a set of double doors with a sign above that read, "Pediatric Ward." I felt my heart skip a beat. The stories about the pediatric ward at St. Mercy's were the most disturbing. It was said that the hospital had experimented on children there, subjecting them to cruel and inhumane treatments in the name of psychiatry. Many of the patients had died, their spirits supposedly haunting the ward to this day. Dave stopped in his tracks. "Man, I'm not going in there." I turned to him. "Come on, we've come this far. What's the worst that could happen?" He looked at me with wide eyes. "Seriously? You're gonna ask that?" I couldn't blame him for being nervous. My own gut was screaming at me to leave, but curiosity pushed me forward. I placed my hand on the door and gave it a shove. It groaned open with a loud creaking sound, echoing through the silent hallways. The pediatric ward was worse than I expected. The walls were covered in faded murals of smiling animals, but the images were distorted by years of neglect. Rows of rusted hospital beds lined the room, their mattresses torn and stained with who knows what. I couldn't help but feel like we had stepped into a nightmare, a place that had witnessed horrors we couldn't begin to understand. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle. I froze, shining my flashlight around the room. There was no one there, but the sound had been real. It wasn't my imagination. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dave nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, let's get out of here." Before we could move, there was a sudden bang from the far end of the ward, like a door slamming shut. I whipped my flashlight toward the noise, and for a brief moment, I saw something. A figure, small and childlike, darting into one of the rooms. "Did you see that?" I asked, my pulse racing. "Let's go," Dave hissed, already backing toward the exit. But I couldn't. I had to know. Against my better judgment, I moved toward the room where the figure had gone. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open with trembling hands. The room was empty, except for a single bed in the center. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something else. An old yellowed file sitting on the bed. It looked like a patient's file covered in dust and grime. I picked it up and wiped the cover clean, revealing the name, Emma Carter. I flipped it open, my eyes scanning the contents. Emma had been a patient at St. Mercy's in 1983. She was 6 years old and had been admitted for severe behavioral issues. The file described her treatment in horrifying detail: electric shock therapy, isolation, experimental drugs. The last entry was dated September 12, 1983, the day she had died during one of the treatments. My hands started shaking as I realized what I was holding. This was real. Emma was real. And I had seen her. Before I could process any of it, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs and the lights on my flashlight started flickering. Then I heard it again, that soft, childlike giggle. But this time it was closer. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. There, standing in the doorway, was a little girl. Her hair was matted, her skin pale and almost translucent. She wore a dirty hospital gown, and her eyes were wide and empty, staring straight at me. "Play with me," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. My flashlight flickered and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. "Dave!" I shouted, but there was no answer. The little girl stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. "You can't leave. Not yet." I scrambled for the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the handle. I could feel her getting closer, the air around me growing colder and heavier. Finally, the door flew open, and I bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back. I found Dave waiting by the window we had come through, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. Now," he said. I didn't argue. We climbed out of the window and ran through the forest, not stopping until we reached the car. Neither of us said a word the whole drive back, but I could tell from the look on Dave's face that he had experienced something too, something we weren't ready to talk about. I haven't been back to St. Mercy's since that night, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear her giggle. I can still feel the cold breath of the past reaching out from the shadows, and I know that Emma is still there, waiting for someone else to play her twisted game. I'll never forget the night the dead came knocking. It started like any other evening, quiet, uneventful, almost peaceful. I'd just settled into my old creaky armchair, the weight of a long day finally lifting off my shoulders. The sound of the wind rattling through the brittle branches outside was the only noise disturbing the silence. But then it happened. 3 knocks. Just 3. Solid, deliberate, and too heavy to be from anything human. I live out in the middle of nowhere, in an old farmhouse I inherited from my grandparents. My nearest neighbor is miles away. So, when I heard that knocking on the door at close to midnight, my blood ran cold. I wasn't expecting anyone, and no one should have been out there. And certainly not tonight. Halloween. I sat frozen for a moment, thinking I must have imagined it. Maybe the wind had knocked something loose, or maybe a tree branch brushed against the door. But there it was again. 3 heavy knocks, exactly the same as before. My heart thudded in my chest, and for the first time in a long time, I felt true fear. I stood up slowly, the wooden floor creaking under my feet. With each step, I debated whether to open the door or not. Something deep in my gut told me that whatever was on the other side wasn't human. But curiosity, or maybe a twisted sense of dread, pulled me toward it. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling slightly. As soon as my fingers brushed the cold brass, I stopped. My breath hitched in my throat when I noticed the silence. The wind had died down. Not a single leaf rustled outside. The quiet was suffocating. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I twisted the knob and opened the door, just a crack. Nothing. No one was there. The porch was empty, the gravel driveway untouched, and the trees stood motionless under the pale glow of the moon. I exhaled in relief and chuckled to myself. I must have been on edge for no reason. I was just being paranoid. Halloween tends to do that, right? I was about to close the door when I noticed something on the ground right at the foot of the steps. A small box, old, wooden, and worn, like it had been left out in the elements for decades. I bent down, picking it up gingerly. It was strangely heavy for its size, the wood cold and rough against my skin. As soon as I touched it, a chill crawled up my spine, and I swear the temperature around me dropped by 10 degrees. I stood there, staring at the box, when the knocking came again. But this time it wasn't from the door, it was from inside the box. I dropped it instantly, stumbling backward into the house. The door slammed shut behind me. My breathing was shallow, panic bubbling up in my throat. What the hell was that? I backed up, keeping my eyes glued to the box that now sat eerily still on the porch. The knocking stopped. For what felt like an eternity, everything was silent again. Then, the sound of scratching started. Faint at first, like claws or nails dragging against wood, but it quickly grew louder, more frantic. It was coming from the box. Whatever was inside wanted out. I did what any sane person would do. I locked the door, bolted it, and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. No signal. Of course, I lived in the middle of nowhere. There was no cell service out here, especially on stormy nights like this. I was alone, completely cut off from the world, with that thing outside my door. I paced back and forth, trying to figure out what to do next. Call for help? Drive to town? But that would mean going outside, and I wasn't about to go near that box again. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. Just like that, it was gone. The silence was almost more terrifying than the noise. I waited, straining to hear anything, footsteps, rustling, anything, but the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then the knocking returned. But this time it was louder. It wasn't coming from the box anymore. It was coming from inside my house. I froze. The knocks were slow and deliberate, echoing from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, everywhere at once. I looked around, my pulse racing, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. But it was as if the entire house was alive with that sound. And then a voice, low, guttural, and barely a whisper, called my name. Ian. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind raced. How did it know my name? I hadn't said anything out loud. It was impossible. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife I could find, my hands trembling as I clutched it, as if a knife could do anything against whatever was happening here. The voice came again, louder this time. Ian, let us in. I felt sick. My stomach twisted into knots, and my legs felt weak. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting from window to window. All of them were locked, all of them secure. There was no way anything could have gotten in. So how was it inside? I crept toward the living room, knife in hand, and that's when I saw them. Figures, shadowy, barely human shapes standing at the windows, their hollow eyes staring straight at me. There were at least 5 of them, their faces pale and sunken, their hands pressed against the glass. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. My throat went dry. I backed away, inching toward the hallway, but my feet felt like lead. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. It was like they had me trapped in some invisible web, holding me in place with nothing but their gaze. Then the knocking started again, louder this time, shaking the walls. My chest tightened as the figures outside began to move. Slowly, methodically, they raised their hands and knocked, once, twice, 3 times, on every window, every door. The sound echoed through the house, a cacophony of dread that made my ears ring. I dropped the knife. It clattered to the floor, useless. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I was surrounded. The voice came again, clearer this time, as if it was right next to me. Ian, open the door. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to think, had to do something before it was too late. But what? What could I possibly do against them? The knocking grew more violent, more desperate. The windows rattled in their frames, and the door shook on its hinges. I felt like I was going to pass out from the sheer terror that had taken hold of me. My vision blurred, and I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears. Then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Everything was still. The figures were gone, vanished, as if they had never been there. I stood there, my breath coming in short gasps, waiting for something to happen. For a long moment, nothing did. And just as I dared to believe it was over, the voice whispered one final time, "We'll be back, Ian." And then, silence. That was 2 nights ago. I haven't left the house since. I keep the doors locked, the windows shut tight, and the lights on at all times. But I know it won't matter. They'll come back. They always do. And next time, I'm not sure I'll have the strength to keep them out. It started with the noises. Faint at first, like the sound of distant scratching or the scurrying of tiny feet. But as time passed, they grew louder, more insistent, more deliberate. I would hear them mostly at night, long after the world outside had gone quiet and the house had settled into its usual stillness. At first, I told myself it was mice. My house, after all, was old, a 2-story Victorian relic, isolated on the outskirts of a town most people had never heard of. I'd inherited it from my late aunt, who, for reasons that made little sense at the time, had never allowed anyone inside during the last years of her life. After her passing, I moved in, figuring it'd be a fresh start after a string of bad luck in the city. But soon enough, the house started to feel less like a home and more like something else entirely. The first few weeks were uneventful, if not a little eerie. The house was huge, with rooms that seemed to stretch forever and corners where the shadows lingered long after the sun went down. It was the kind of place that always seemed too quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. But I ignored the feeling. A new house, an old house, would take some getting used to, I told myself. And then came the scratching. I'd be lying in bed just about to drift off when I'd hear it. Soft, barely perceptible at first. I thought maybe a bird had nested in the attic, or some rodent had found its way into the walls. I tried to ignore it, assuming it would go away on its own. But it didn't. In fact, it got worse. The scratching grew louder, more persistent. And it wasn't just in one place. It moved. One night I heard it coming from behind the wall next to my bed. Another night, it seemed to come from the ceiling. Sometimes it would travel from one end of the room to the other, a faint scratching noise like something or someone was crawling through the walls, searching for a way out. I tried everything. I set traps, called pest control, even had a handyman come by to check for leaks or gaps in the walls. But nothing helped. No signs of rodents, no nests, no explanation for the sounds. The handyman, an older gentleman with years of experience working in old houses, looked at me strangely when I described the noises. "It's an old house," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Wood expands, contracts, things shift." But this wasn't the normal groaning of an old house settling. I knew that much. This was different. This felt alive. After weeks of sleepless nights, I started to lose it. The sounds had become more frequent, more aggressive. They didn't just happen at night anymore. Sometimes I'd be sitting in the living room during the day, reading a book or watching TV, and I'd hear that familiar scratching sound, like something moving just out of sight, right behind the walls. One evening, I'd had enough. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the house was bathed in that strange twilight glow when everything looked slightly off. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when the scratching started again. But this time it wasn't faint. It was loud, and it was coming from the wall directly behind me. I froze, my hands submerged in soapy water, and turned my head slowly. There, behind the wallpaper, something was moving. I could see it, an outline, a shadow shifting behind the thin layer of plaster. My stomach twisted into a knot. I stepped back, the dish slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. The shadow in the wall stopped. For a moment, the kitchen was silent, save for the sound of my own shallow breathing. Then, slowly, the scratching started again. This time, it seemed to be coming from multiple places at once. From behind the wall, from the ceiling above, from the floor beneath my feet. It was everywhere. I backed out of the kitchen, heart pounding in my chest, and ran to the living room. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. I called a local exterminator, desperate to get someone out here to check again. When the voice on the other end of the line picked up, I barely managed to get the words out. But just as I started to explain the situation, the scratching stopped, completely. As if whatever was making the noise had vanished into thin air. I paused, the phone pressed to my ear, waiting. Silence. The person on the other end of the call asked if I was still there, but I hung up. I stood in the middle of the living room, scanning the walls, the ceiling, the floor, listening for the slightest sound. Nothing. The house was dead quiet. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, pacing the house, waiting for the scratching to start again. But it didn't. Not a single noise. For the next 2 days, the house was silent. No scratching. No shadows. Nothing. It was almost as if whatever had been tormenting me had decided to leave. I started to relax, thinking maybe I'd finally lost it, and the whole thing had been in my head. But then came the voices. It was late, probably around 2 a.m, and I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I was just about to drift off when I heard it. A whisper. Faint, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. "I'm here." I shot up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I glanced around the room, my eyes wide, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. "I'm here." The voice came again, this time clearer. It was coming from the wall. I bolted out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall, listening, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, faint, but there, someone, or something, was speaking from inside the wall. "I'm here. Let me out." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug in my haste to get away. My mind was racing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Let me out." I grabbed my phone, dialing the first number that came to mind. My friend Marcus, the only person who might believe me. The phone rang, and just as I thought it would go to voicemail, he picked up. "Dude, it's 2 a.m, he groaned. "What's going on?" I need you to come over," I stammered. "Please, something's happening. There's something in the walls. It's talking to me." There was a long pause on the other end. "Are you serious?" "Just come, Marcus. Please." An hour later, Marcus showed up. He looked groggy, still half asleep, but when he saw the look on my face, he knew something was wrong. "Okay, man," he said, stepping inside. "What's going on?" I told him everything. About the scratching, the shadow in the wall, the voice. He listened, his expression growing more serious by the minute. "All right," he said once I'd finished. "Let's take a look." We spent the next hour walking through the house, listening, searching for any sign of the noises. But the house was silent. Not a single sound. No scratching, no voices. Nothing. "I swear, Marcus," I said, my voice trembling. "It was here. I heard it." Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, man, I believe you. But maybe you're just stressed. I mean, this place is old. It's got history, right? Maybe you're hearing things." I didn't know what to say. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was losing it. Marcus stayed the night, just to be sure. He slept on the couch, and for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. The house was quiet. The next morning, Marcus left, and I started to feel a little better. Maybe I had been imagining things. Maybe it was just stress. But that night, it happened again. I was lying in bed just about to fall asleep when I heard it. The whisper, "I'm here. Let me out." This time it was louder, clearer. I sat up, my heart pounding. The voice was coming from the walls again, but now it wasn't alone. There were more voices, whispering, murmuring, calling out from every direction. "Let us out." I bolted out of bed, running through the house, trying to escape the voices. They were everywhere, growing louder, more insistent. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, like they were alive, like something inside was trying to break free. I grabbed my phone, dialing Marcus again, but the call wouldn't go through. The voices were all I could hear, filling my head, drowning out everything else. "Let us out. We're here." I fell to my knees in the living room, my hands covering my ears. But it didn't help. The voices were inside me now, whispering, screaming, demanding to be freed. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the voices stopped. The house was silent again. I don't know what's in the walls, or how long it's been there. But I do know one thing. It's not going away. And every night, it whispers my name. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited a dusty old trunk that had sat untouched in her attic for as long as I could remember. It was a weathered thing, with iron fittings and faded leather, covered in a layer of dust that hinted at the secrets it held inside. My grandmother had always spoken of it in hushed tones, her voice filled with both reverence and fear. "That trunk holds our family history," she'd say, "but it also holds curses." I was intrigued. Growing up, I had heard countless stories about cursed objects, but to possess one, an actual family heirloom with a history, sent chills down my spine. The trunk was supposed to contain treasures, keepsakes from generations past, but my grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind. Would I find something valuable, or would it bring misfortune? After a long day of sorting through her belongings, I decided to open the trunk that night. The attic was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and memories. As I unlatched the rusty clasps, a strange sensation washed over me, a feeling that I was about to disturb something that had been sleeping for a very long time. The lid creaked open, revealing a jumble of old clothes, letters, and trinkets. I sifted through the items, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. Among the various relics, I found a small wooden box, intricately carved with strange symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering light of the attic bulb. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the box. Inside lay a delicate locket and a faded photograph of a woman I didn't recognize. The woman had a haunting beauty, her eyes staring directly into the camera with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. On the back of the photograph was a name, Eliza, and beneath it, a date, March 18th, 1923. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I lay in bed, the image of Eliza's piercing gaze haunted my thoughts. I turned on the lights and rummaged through the letters I had found in the trunk. Most were mundane, but one stood out, written in elegant script. "Dear Margaret," it began, "I cannot keep this secret any longer. The locket you have entrusted to me brings great misfortune to those who wear it. I fear it has cursed our family for generations." My heart raced as I read the letter. I thought back to the stories my grandmother used to tell me, tales of family members who had suffered tragic fates after coming into contact with certain heirlooms. The locket must be one of them. Despite my better judgment, I couldn't resist trying it on. It hung heavy around my neck, the cold metal pressing against my skin. Almost immediately, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The room spun, and I staggered back, gripping the edge of the dresser to steady myself. As my vision cleared, I caught a glimpse of the mirror and gasped. Reflected in the glass was not my own image, but that of Eliza. her expression filled with sorrow. I blinked and she vanished, leaving only my bewildered reflection staring back. Panic set in. I ripped the locket from my neck and tossed it onto the bed. The next day, I decided to learn more about Eliza. I visited the local library and scoured through the archives, hoping to find some information about her. Hours passed as I pored over old newspapers and genealogical records. Finally, I found a mention of Eliza in an article from 1923. Tragic accident claims life of local heiress. According to the article, Eliza had been engaged to a wealthy man but had vanished just days before the wedding. Her body was discovered days later, floating in the river. The article hinted at scandal and whispers of a family curse tied to her tragic fate. As I read, a sense of dread washed over me. I realized that I was now a part of this dark legacy. That night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before. I tried to shake it off, but it clung to me like a shadow. The moment I closed my eyes, I was transported into a dream, one filled with darkness and despair. I stood on the banks of the river where Eliza had drowned, the water swirling ominously. Suddenly, the figure of Eliza appeared, her eyes pleading. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. "You must find my locket. It is the key to freeing me." I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. The dream felt so real, and her voice lingered in my mind. I knew I had to confront this curse head on. The next morning, I returned to the attic, determined to search the trunk more thoroughly. I rummaged through the clothes and letters, and finally my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I pulled out an ornate key, covered in dust and cobwebs. It was unlike anything I had seen before, intricate and old, with the same strange symbols as the box. A sudden thought struck me. Perhaps this key was connected to Eliza's locket. I quickly grabbed the locket and the key, leaving the attic with a sense of purpose. I needed to discover what they unlocked. My first stop was the old mansion where Eliza had lived, now abandoned and decaying. The townsfolk had long since whispered tales of its haunted past, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached the crumbling facade. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a dark hallway filled with dust and memories. I searched the mansion room by room, hoping to find a hidden compartment or a lock that the key might fit. In one of the upstairs rooms, I found a grand mirror, covered in a thin layer of dust. It was beautiful, but as I leaned closer, I noticed an inscription etched along the bottom. "Only the true heir can unlock the past." I pulled the key from my pocket and examined it closely. The same symbols from the mirror were on the key. My heart raced with anticipation as I inserted the key into a small hidden lock at the base of the mirror. It turned with a satisfying click, and the mirror shimmered, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Inside lay a journal, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, the smell of old paper filling the air. It belonged to Eliza. The entries were filled with her hopes, dreams, and fears, but one particular entry caught my eye. March 15, 1923. I fear the locket will bring ruin to my family. It has changed me, made me see things I shouldn't. I feel it watching me, waiting. I must hide it, but where? Eliza's words chilled me to the bone. I was now convinced that the locket was not merely a cursed object, but something far more sinister. I had to find out what happened to it and how it linked to her tragic fate. Days passed as I dug deeper into Eliza's life. I visited her grave, spoke to the townsfolk who had known her, and uncovered more details about her engagement. Her fiancé had been a charming man, but there were whispers of jealousy and betrayal surrounding their relationship. I wondered if he had played a part in her disappearance. One evening, as I sifted through the trunk again, I discovered another item, a small ornate box that had been wedged in the corner. Inside was a delicate silver ring adorned with a small dark gemstone. It radiated an eerie energy that sent shivers down my spine. Was this the source of the curse? I didn't know, but I had to find out. That night, I decided to return to the river where Eliza had drowned, hoping to connect with her spirit one last time. Armed with the locket, the key, and the ring, I stood on the riverbank, the water flowing silently beneath the moonlight. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Eliza," I called out, my voice trembling. "I'm here to help you. Please show me what I need to do." The air grew heavy and the water began to swirl. A figure emerged, and there was Eliza, her eyes filled with both sorrow and relief. "You found my ring," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rushing water. "It is part of the curse." I held it out to her. "What must I do?" "Eliminate the curse," she said, her voice echoing like a distant wind. "You must return the ring to the river where I fell, and the locket must never be worn again. Only then can my spirit be set free." With trembling hands, I tossed the ring into the river, watching as it sank into the depths. I felt a rush of energy surge through me, as if the water itself acknowledged my action. Eliza's form began to shimmer and fade. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice growing softer. "You have saved me." With that, she disappeared into the night, leaving only the gentle sound of the river behind. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. I had broken the curse, freed Eliza's spirit, and perhaps saved my family from the shadows of the past. The following days felt lighter. The oppressive weight that had haunted me since I found the trunk seemed to lift. The scratching sounds in the walls faded, and the feeling of being watched disappeared. I returned to the attic to close the trunk, ensuring it was properly secured. As I locked it for the last time, I couldn't help but feel gratitude for the journey. The trunk had brought to light the dark history of my family, but it had also shown me the power of compassion, understanding, and closure. Yet, there was one last thought that lingered in my mind. Had I truly freed Eliza, or had I merely postponed the curse? After all, family heirlooms are often passed down through generations, carrying the weight of their history with them. As I turned to leave the attic, I couldn't shake the feeling that the echoes of the past would always be a part of me. And perhaps, in some hidden corner of the world, the locket still whispered her name, waiting for another unwitting heir to unlock its secrets.